Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Figure It Out cast for July 2024. I am your host, Adam Koralik, and I am joined by awesome, amazing Patreon backer, Joseph. Welcome back, Joseph.
Thanks, Adam. I'm glad to be here. Glad we actually also managed to get this to happen in July.
I know, right? So, we'll get to that. Don't you worry. But yeah, so apologies to everybody out there since he's just kind of admitting it. This took a lot longer, at least if you're a Patreon backer, this took longer than usual to come out. And there is a reason for that, which we'll get into later. But yeah, no, everything's fine. And if you're listening to this publicly, hey, appreciate you. Hopefully you could check out my Patreon where normally you would get access to this a few weeks in advance, not just a few days. And also you'd get access to all the videos normally. You can also get shout outs, you can pick subjects, or you can even be on the podcast, much like Joseph is. So I appreciate the support. Let's go ahead and get into it. Now, Joseph, as a Patreon backer who gets to be here, you also get to pick a subject. And yeah, you had one. So do you want to go ahead and introduce it?
Sure. So I'm sure anyone who's been listening to this podcast since I've been on it, or especially in recent memory, know that we have a tendency to talk about Xbox stuff a lot when Xbox stuff happens. Anyway, guess what happened recently?
Some Xbox stuff?
Yeah. So it turns out
that
Microsoft has decided that they need to raise the price of Xbox Game Pass. Again. But this time it's not just like a straight price increase. There's a little bit of weird stuff going on with one of the tiers in particular. And while I don't know how much we're going to actually talk about it overall, because I figured, hey, this is the thing that we kind of talk about whenever it happens. Might as well bring it up. Mm-hmm. So, let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. Game Pass Ultimate is going up by like $2 or something. I don't actually have the email in front of me, which is not great on my part, but...
Yeah, how dare you be unprepared? Sits here not being prepared myself.
Yeah, okay. Where's that? Whatever. Whatever. Game Pass Ultimate's price increase isn't really that big of a deal. It's going up to like around $20. They also have... But here's where things get weird and annoying and kind of icky corporation type deal. So, they're getting rid of one of their tiers. They're getting rid of their Xbox Game Pass for console tier, which is what you get if you only want Game Pass for your Xbox, and what you currently have, which has access to day one games and all the Game Pass perks. So they're getting rid of that, but they are grandfathering in everyone who currently has it. So anyone who has it now, as long as you never cancel Game Pass, or, never have your credit card expire and your payment doesn't go through, you will be able to keep playing games on Game Pass day one on your Xbox for your current tier. Otherwise, you'd have to get Xbox Game Pass Standard, which includes something that they call Xbox Game Pass Gold, otherwise known as Xbox Live, which is your multiplayer stuff, which wasn't included in the Game Pass for Xbox, technically. But their new Game Pass Standard doesn't have access to day one games. So, if you were really, really excited to have, to play a very massive popular FPS game that's coming out very soon, that Microsoft recently got access to, but you didn't have Game Pass yet.
Wait,
I'll just go for the console option because I don't play on PC.
Do you mean Call of Duty?
Yes. You're kind of screwed, unless if you want to pay for Game Pass Ultimate, is what I think is how this went. So, yeah. Not to mention, a whole confusing thing where Game Pass Core is your online game thing that's included in Game Pass Standard, which is... Yeah, so this whole thing's a mess on several levels. Obviously, there's Microsoft. It's like being a whole greedy corporation thing and raising prices on the thing that they've been pushing for years. Because let's be honest, like Game Pass almost certainly was not sustainable at the prices they were. Honestly, probably still not sustainable at the prices they're at now, but...
Yeah, all right, so let's just dissect that for a second. First of all, that is the common, they're greedy argument. I'm not saying you're making this case. It's just that you use that word, so I want to basically go at this. They're not being a greedy corporation because the concept of a corporation is for the sole purpose of generating revenue. That's not greed. That's literally the whole point of the company. But secondly, it's not greed because they run it at a loss. They always have. And if you've listened to this podcast, and I know you have, Joseph, because you've been on it, then you guys all know what we've been saying forever. Like when Rob was still here, we were all talking about it. Game Pass is a totally unsustainable business model. It always was. The whole idea was just to get these systems in the homes, get everybody kind of addicted to that whole network, and just kind of make Xbox an ecosystem that was considered essential the way Windows is essentially considered essential within PCs. And you would be willing to spend that kind of money on that sort of effort if you thought the end result was total dominance. It failed. So now they're in a let's wind things down and shut things down and change things phase, which you remember, Joseph. We've talked about this before. The past few months, there were a lot of rumors about Microsoft maybe leaving consoles, Microsoft maybe not doing this anymore, maybe they're going to stop doing hardware, etc. This is also probably...
layoffs.
Yes, exactly. Right. And the development studios they were shutting down. This is one of many steps they are doing to try and course correct damage. Because... There was definitely that, after they shut down those studios, there was definitely that chicken with their heads cut off phase. This is probably just the next plan to try and reduce damages. Increase the price of Game Pass and try to, frankly, push some people out of it completely, because the more people that aren't interested in the service anymore is the less people you have to, like, stick around and support. Which is, I think that they have no choice but to keep people who are grandfathered in, but they'll probably try to make that as hard as possible to stay in there. As for, the other obvious thing is what we were saying all along. You cannot generate revenue on these games when you're not charging anybody for the games. I did a video on this once. I'm sure we talked about it as well, Joseph, but basically, like, in a short, the only people making money off Game Pass were third-party developers who were cutting deals with Microsoft. Because Microsoft, or let's say, again, I'll just explain it again. So, like, you're a third-party company, like a Sega or something like that. And you're like, hey, we have our new Sonic game. We're going to be putting it on all the platforms, including Xbox. Microsoft's like, hey, put it on Game Pass. And Sega's like, well, there's no reason to do that, because when we do that, people just download it. We don't make anything off it. So Microsoft's like, well, no, all right. How many sales do you expect to have, and et cetera? Let's come to an agreement here. So Microsoft will just outright give them cash, like a check that says, okay, $150 million or something. I'm making up these numbers in guaranteed sales. That way you're basically gambling. Sega's gambling the game wouldn't have performed that well. But they would be very content if it made that much money. They're basically getting a guaranteed sale, and at that point they're willing to eat the rest of it if there is a rest of it. But it also could have been a game that would have only generated like 10 million in sales, and they did way better. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Right.
But either way, that would be a third-party situation where they make a bunch of money. When Microsoft's doing this internally for properties they already own, they're not having to pay themselves back for it. So they're basically just throwing games up there and saying, yeah, this is awesome. Our game's going to do really well. And this is where it started to hurt the development teams behind those games, because inevitably their games can't actually generate revenue because Microsoft forced them to effectively give it away for free to push Game Pass. And in doing so, we see a lot of those shutdowns and restructurings and all that sort of stuff that we saw before. This is just the next phase of it. This is some attempt to stop the bleeding, and it's not surprising to me whatsoever that the biggest games that they had intended to have on here will no longer be there day one, as it were, just because that's where the majority of the revenue was.
I do need to clarify something.
Please do.
That's only on their Game Pass standard that's coming out. Game Pass Ultimate and PC Game Pass will still have day one games. It's only on the Xbox console only tier that won't have day one games.
Okay, good. And that'll, I still think that'll buy it time, but it's obvious they recognize the problem. But the thing is, when you have that many people locked into something like that, that's why it's kind of hard to shift everybody around. So I think there are quite a few changes that are trying to either force people to upgrade or get people to burn away. In my case, I actually had Xbox Game Pass Core only because it was formerly Xbox Live Gold, and it auto-renewed without my consent. So I was kind of stuck with it for a year. But then they're like, hey, it's about to update. It'll also, instead of being like $60, it's now like $75 or whatever. And I was like, I don't want this. So I went ahead and deactivated it.
Yeah, and of course, Game Pass Core is just the online game.
Yeah, that's pretty much all it is. It's pretty much just online support, and then it has a handful of Game Pass games they throw up every once in a while. But it's like really obvious ones, like, you know, Fallout 76 and other stuff like that. So it's just, I never got any use out of it. It was a complete waste of money. It was a complete accident that I still had it. But yeah, I'm severing that service, and in a weird way, even though it wasn't actually their fault, I also kind of did that because of the CrowdStrike thing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Yeah, so whatever. That's basically what's going on with Game Pass, and I would not be shocked if these changes continue. It's just, the simple reality, guys, is Microsoft's general attitude towards the Xbox brand has always been, we're willing to run it at a loss for some sort of eventual domination of that industry. And it's been 23 years, and it hasn't achieved the goals they intended. It's achieved some of them. You know, they protected the PC market, ironically. That was a success. But basically turning Xbox into the Windows of game consoles, meaning it's just total dominance and always accepted to be in everything.
That never happened. And
that never materialized.
It's not happening.
Yeah, it's not going to happen at this point. And so I can see why they're trying to change that around. But it's also kind of difficult to do that for a lot of reasons. But this is just a step in trying to correct that. But I wouldn't be shocked if this was also somewhat short-term committee thinking, as opposed to like long-term, here's the first step towards our new plan. This is probably just, we need to stop the bleeding a little bit.
Oh yeah, it's obviously short-term, because if they were actually thinking long-term, they would, well, for one thing, if they were getting rid of day one games on their lowest console-only tier, they probably would have also gotten rid of day one games on the single PC tier, and just had left it as Game Pass, as something for Game Pass Ultimate, for one thing.
Yeah.
They probably would have also come up with a less stupid name for their new console-only tier of Game Pass, instead of Game Pass Standard, which includes Game Pass Core.
Yeah, it's Microsoft, man. I never give them credit on names because they're terrible at that. I'll give them a pass on that one.
Okay.
I'll give them a Game Pass. Get it? Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you still have any form of Xbox Game Pass?
I do, but it's mostly because I keep forgetting to actually undo it. So once I'm like, oh, that renewed, I'll go play a game on Game Pass for a bit, and then I'm like, okay, cool, I did that. I justified the $17 that I have.
Yeah,
after
to be
a couple
fair,
of days. Okay.
I want to look at this from the other side, okay? Because there's obviously people that are huge fans of Game Pass. They like the idea that, you know, I subscribe to this service. At least it did cost, you know, like $60 a year, at least the core version. I don't know, what does Ultimate cost? Is it like $130 a year or something?
It's probably about $240 now. It's going up to $20, but it was $17 a month, and I've been paying monthly. So
fair enough. I don't know what it costs. Whatever.
But I mean, even then, if you use it, it's a good deal. The problem is that like, this past year, I hyper-focused on Starfield super hard, and then after December happened, it was like, okay, I love this game enough, I'm just going to buy it, and then I can use some of the mods that don't work on the PC Game Pass version. So at that point, I kind of lost a reason to have Game Pass. But at that point, if you're just playing a single game, it's not worth it, because after 3 months, you could have just bought the damn thing.
that was kind of the point I was making, is that there's definitely going to be people who are like, whatever, that sunk in cost is worth it to me because of how much I use it. The simple truth is, to a lot of us, it's not, because we don't really use it. And that's fine. Either side you come down on that is fine. That's not really the point of the discussion. The point of the discussion is really that we are finally reaching a point where Microsoft has accepted that this is not a sustainable model. So I will tell you right now that you should enjoy this while it still exists. If you already do, it will cost more money, but keep in mind, even though that's annoying, it's costing them way more to keep this functional. And don't expect it to survive in perpetuity. Like, this will stop at some point. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah,
could be years.
I mean, because it didn't work is the thing. Like, if it had actually worked, it would have stuck around. It would definitely stick around.
Precisely.
Although
I will maintain, if it even had worked, you still would have had massive price increases, because now you wouldn't have had any competition. Either way, it was going to go up. It was just a matter of, do you commit to it or not? And I realize we're going to have kind of a biased audience, because mostly everybody listening to this is probably very much in the team of, hey, retro games and game preservation, etc. But in general, I would basically say that if you're the type of person who's had Game Pass and that's what you've been spending your money on, you have an Xbox and you have a Game Pass and you've just been, hey, I stick around with that and I play whatever comes around. Good luck to you in a number of years when you realize you don't really have a game collection of any kind. And you can't sell it back. You can't rebuy it necessarily. And yeah, I could see that being a strange thing for nostalgia eventually. But that's a different discussion. Yeah. Anything else you want to say on the Game Pass price changes?
Not on the price changes specifically, but now I'm just trying to think, like, in like a different timeline to say, where like when Xbox did Game Pass, it was only games they owned. Do you think that even at like the $15 or $20 a month for all of it, do you think it could have actually been sustainable, or do you still think it would have screwed everything up?
I think that would have lasted a lot longer. I mean, it still would have been Microsoft looking at their own internal numbers and being like, we're hemorrhaging money on games, but they wouldn't have been hemorrhaging money to third-party developers.
Right. And they could actually like maybe track and see like, okay, yeah, this game we released caused a big, huge spike in subs, so we can probably attribute that spike to this and say, okay, we got this amount. Okay, that was a good success. With like the third-party things, even if the subs do go up that much, it's like with how much money they're hemorrhaging, it's just like it almost doesn't matter how well a game does on Game Pass. They're not making money.
I would actually argue that it's not the third parties that hurt them so much. It was the Activision deal.
Well, yeah, that hurt them completely.
If that had never happened, I don't think we'd be dealing with this right now. If anything, the Activision deal probably shrunk the lifespan of Game Pass by like a decade.
Yeah,
just because the amount of money they sunk into that was the thing that made Microsoft higher ups finally raise an eyebrow and be like, why are we still doing this? They were more than content to leave the Xbox division alone and let it play with the company money, the company credit card, what have you, because they understood the end game was we protected the PC market and we're trying to basically take over the video game market while we're losing money on it. We're not, it's not totally insane on a Microsoft scale. I mean, when you hear that they bought Activision for basically like $68 billion in assets, and then you compare that to the fact that they lost $4 billion on the original Xbox, that almost sounds quaint. It's like they lost $4 billion to protect the PC market from the console market. That's the actual history of it.
I mean, to be fair, they could argue that $4 billion was a lot more worth it because it kept their entire business alive. But
that is exactly my point. That's exactly my point. They were like, whatever, we're willing to lose $4 billion on this thing so that the entirety of the Windows ecosystem survives and dominates. That's worth every penny. That's fine. But absorbing $68 billion in assets and getting the right to give the games away for free, probably not something they're too happy about. So
Right.
that's why it doesn't shock me that that's the point of order number one with this update to Game Pass is that the standard edition will no longer have access to things like Call of Duty right away because they want those people to bring money in to offset some of the damage done by the Activision merger. That's probably why that's there, chief among anything else.
That said, again, if you already have the console-only version, you are grandfathered in as long as you keep paying.
Yeah.
But that
Probably
because
they don't want to violate some terms of service agreement.
Also, the FTC is not actually happy about this. They're like, Microsoft, when we were going through the entire hearing for the merger, this is This is one of the things that you specified exactly you would not do. So they're not too happy about that.
Yeah, that could lead to some issues. I was about to say that's probably because they wanted to avoid, legal issues. That's why they're grandfathering people in. And I'm wondering if a creative lawyer said, no, man, people can still use it as long as they don't stop using it. As opposed to, like, we never said new people could sign up, but existing customers, happy to stay. That's probably what that is.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Legalese, man.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's fun. Anything else you want to say on this?
Nah, like I said, this was just something I thought we should bring up because, I mean, it's a thing that we talk about whenever something with this happens. So
I agree, and you did well, I think. So thank you, Joseph, for that. We'll move on to the next subject, which comes from Spencer Puryear. Now, to be fair, Spencer Puryear, I reached out and I didn't hear anything back, so we're going to pick something on his behalf. And I thought that this would be a perfect time to talk about CrowdStrike and the whole debacle with that. So here's, if you all heard about this, you had to have. This is basically like whatever it was, like Friday the 19th or so of July. I'll let Joseph explain the technical side of this, but basically CrowdStrike sends out a firmware update that basically throws Windows into a boot loop panic attack, and that caused issues across the entire world with computers just shutting down and not functioning properly, which led to a whole lot of problems everywhere. I personally got stuck in some of that, and we'll talk about that in a second, and that also would explain why the podcast took so much longer. But Joseph, I'm going to let you kind of explain what happened from a more technical perspective, as you're very familiar with these types of things.
Alrighty. Well, I will preface this right away by saying that I'm not, I can't say for certain what happened. I can only really go off of news and stuff, but to give a general idea based on what I've heard about it, CrowdStrike is a company that deals with cybersecurity type applications. So when they create the application that all these computers that shut down were using, what they ended up doing to do it is that they basically wrote their security program as a hardware driver that's installed on the kernel of the Windows OS, so that could actually function at the low level and do what it needs to do to prevent cyber attacks and stuff like that. Which means that if anything happens down there and there's not any proper exception handling or anything like that, and something unexpected happens that the code was not expecting, doesn't know how to gracefully save itself from, your entire PC blows up, basically, which is what happened, which is why we got the blue screens. Microsoft had nothing to do with this.
But they were blamed for
the fact that Windows was where CrowdStrike pushed this code to.
Yeah, they were definitely blamed for it because I kind of joked about it before that was part of why I stopped submitting the Xbox Core plan. That was my revenge on Microsoft, even though I'm fully aware it was not their fault. So the way somebody in my Discord explained this really well, it would be like, imagine if every car in the world, that uses gasoline, somebody magically somehow filled all the gas tanks up with diesel, just suddenly. Those cars are just going to stop working as a result of what you just did. They basically had injected this update improperly, and it went automatically and just screwed up a whole bunch of systems. So that's what leads us to a more personal level here, and why this podcast took so long. So here's what happened to me on a personal level. I just got back from Japan. I was lucky enough to get to go out there for a couple of weeks for a gig, which was great. Typically, when it comes to the podcast, we try to record towards the tail end of the first week of the month. That wasn't going to be possible due to when I had to go there. I actually flew out there on July 4th. So I told you and I told Abdullah, like, yeah, sorry guys, this is going to take a little bit longer than normal, but I'm expecting to be back originally on the 17th, which would have been, at the time of recording, would have been a week ago. So that was, it was a little bit later than normal, but it was still kind of in the wheelhouse of tolerable. But here's what ends up happening. So on the 17th in Japan, I was expecting to leave and head back to the States. Now, I screwed up. It turns out my hotel was booked to the 17th. My flight was booked for the 18th. Okay, dumb mistake on my part. Not a big deal. I ended up crashing at a friend of mine's house for the night. It was fine. So the 18th comes around. And I'm like, okay, I go to Haneda, Tokyo's Haneda Airport. And I'm there. I'm, waiting for the flight and everything. And all of a sudden, my flight is canceled. My flight that was going to go from Tokyo to Chicago. And I was like, why is that canceled? That's really weird. And so upon investigation, it turns out what had happened was around that time in Newark, or New York City, basically, there had been a bunch of massive storms. Okay, so those massive storms were so substantial and so dangerous that most flights out of Newark were canceled. This would include the flight that was going to go from Newark to Tokyo, and that flight would have been the exact aircraft I would have been on to go to Chicago. Basically, right. Because that plane never got to Japan, I couldn't take it to Chicago. So, of course, United does what they typically do in these situations. They just kind of rebooked everybody. This time of the year, there's usually, 30, 40 unused seats on any given flight out of, Japan back to the States. So if you lose one, you can kind of compress everybody into the other remaining flights and you'll be fine. And that's exactly what happened to me. They were like, okay, we're going to put you on a flight to Newark, aka New York. And I was like, whatever. So once I get to New York, I'll just change planes and go to Chicago. That's the plan. Fine. So I fly out, I land in New York, I clear customs, all that normal stuff. And then I go to baggage claim. Now, for those who do not know, if you're doing an international flight with a transfer in the United States, when you land, you still have to pick up your bags, even though you're not staying in that place. You have to pick up your bag and they'll have a recheck-in area. So when you recheck it in, it's basically just a security measure to make sure that, hey, you got your bags that were from another country and you're verifying that you've sent them on the way. Partially security measure and probably also so the airlines are less responsible. That's fine. But it meant that rather than just clear customs and go to my gate, I had to sit around and wait for these bags. They took forever to show up. And I attribute this not to United. This was not their fault. This was TSA. And I know that because once I got the bags, they looked like they had been somewhat messed with. I opened them up and naturally there was like a little piece of paper from TSA inside. In fact, they had gone to the extreme length of opening up one of my items that had been sealed up and they repackaged it together with this horrible TSA tape. This is the same group that accidentally, I say accidentally because I can't prove it, took a controller from my Resident Evil Claire Dreamcast once. Anyway.
Right.
Yeah, so anyway, point is that process took forever. To the point where once I had the bags, I was like, I only have like a half hour to get over to my gate and my flight's going to leave. I think it started boarding in like 5 minutes. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. I run out of there. And I'm in Terminal B. I have to get over to Terminal A. Now, if you do that at Newark, that's typically an easy enough process. There's just a train that just takes you over there. That's fine. I was about to do that only to discover that the trains were under repair. So you had to walk outside, which goes from a 2-minute transfer to about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the distance and like how much luggage you have, which I was carrying around 2 bags, each of which I had to weigh at Haneda, so I knew their weight. They were 50 pounds each, or about 22 kilos for our international viewers, each bag. And I had to carry that. Exactly. So it automatically hit me. There was no chance I was going to make this flight. It just wasn't going to happen. It would have left by the time I even got to the terminal. So I just went to the terminal. And then I went over to the United counter and I basically pled my case, and they're like, yeah, we know this is kind of happening a lot today because at that point they're still recovering from all of the weather damage they had gone through to what was for them only like a day earlier. And they were having to deal with all the physical damage of the transfer, the train not being operational properly. Okay. So at this point in the day, which was now like 6 p.m., if you know anything about aviation, you know most flights have kind of stopped by that point. So I was like, what are my options to get to Chicago tonight? And they were like, well, to be honest with you, not a lot. We can put you on something tomorrow if you want to wait. The only thing I have out tonight is a flight to Las Vegas. And then from Las Vegas, you'd get a flight at midnight back to Chicago, landing in Chicago at about 6 in the morning. And I was like, all right, like that's it. That's my only option. I'm going with that. So I went from Tokyo to New York to Las Vegas on my way to Chicago. I flew over my hometown twice on my destination, my goal to get there. So anyway, I get the flight to Vegas. That's fine. No problems. Get on the plane, head to Vegas. Cool. By the time I've landed in Vegas, it's about 8 p.m. in Vegas. So which means I have about 4 hours to wait, and I would have another 4 hours to fly, plus about another hour and a half on a train. I was like, I have not slept for 48 hours. I will die if I try to do this. So once I landed, I went over to the ticket agent again in Vegas, and I was just like, hey, look, I know this is unconventional, but here's what I've been through today. Here's where I'm trying to go to. Can I just move my flight to tomorrow? Like, is there a penalty for that? Whatever. And the lady there was very nice. She's like, oh, honey, that's totally fine. Like, and so she just transferred me over to the next day. She's like, you're good. Go get some sleep. Now, to be fair to United again, this was not their fault. I chose to leave and not get on that flight. Therefore, they didn't owe me a hotel. They weren't actually at fault at any point during any of this. So I go to the hotel, which was a piece of crap. If you were ever in Las Vegas and you see a hotel called OYO or Oyo, it's the cheapest hotel that I could come up with. There's a reason for that. They suck. Don't go there. So when I got to that hotel, I checked in. I have two 50-pound bags. And the guy's like, oh, yeah, by the way, yeah, you're on the 9th floor. There's no functional elevators right now, so you have to use the stairs. I'm like, qu'est-ce que c'est? Nanika? Que? Like, what? Like, so, yeah, he was like, well, if you want, we can give you a refund. I'm like, well, I still need the room, so I don't really have a choice here, do I? So I had to make my way to the staircase and carry two 50-pound bags, aka 22-kilo bags, up a staircase of 9 floors.
Oh, God.
It was awful. And this while I'm dead tired, having not slept in 48 hours. So I eventually do this. I managed to get into my room. This process took so long that by the time I was in the room and I was like, I had taken a shower and I was like ready to not kill everybody, you know, I just calmed down and everything, I decided to go like look at my phone for the first time in quite some time. Now, I fly enough that I've encountered quite a few technical glitches and weird things that show up. Sometimes when you change your flight, you will still get text messages and notifications and things for your old flight, even though you're no longer on it. I got a text notification about the flight I would have taken at midnight saying, due to unforeseen circumstances, your flight is canceled. Something to that effect. Due to technical reasons. Something like that.
Wow.
And I was like, huh, okay, I won one because I'm already at the hotel and I'm not sitting around at LAS now having to deal with this exact same problem. I'm like 4 hours ahead of that problem and I'm already in a hotel room. I won one, right? So I go to bed thinking, okay, my flight's tomorrow at about 3:30. Let's go. I wake up. I check my phone. And this is when all the CrowdStrike stuff had happened. My flight was canceled. Everything is canceled. The world is shutting down. Like, I wake up to this insanity, and I'm like, what is going on? And that's when I start reading that initially it was like, oh, this is a Microsoft problem. Microsoft screwed this up, screwed that up, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay. And my flight was already rescheduled for the next day. I didn't even have a choice in the matter. It was just automatically pushed to the next day. It was like, you're not getting out of here. That's not happening. And I was like, oh, okay, I need another night in this hotel, don't I? And so I was like, I really don't want to walk down those stairs, so I'm going to call them. So I call the front desk. no pickup. I call the reception line, no pickup. I call every, like, I don't know if you've ever been in a hotel where you like look at the phone, it has a whole bunch of random numbers for different departments. Even like room service, I called them, nobody picks up. Nobody's picking up anything. I'm like, I hate this hotel. So I decide, all right, I'm just going to go downstairs. I don't have a choice. So I walk down the stairs, which that part's fine. Walking down the stairs is not a big deal.
Especially
I go into
if you
the
don't bring
lobby.
your bags with you.
Exactly. I go into the lobby, and the lobby is just overloaded with people. Like, everyone's got suitcases. Everybody's pissed off. And they're just like, I can't believe this is happening. I'm like, okay, so this ain't just me that's dealing with something right now, is it? No. As I'm standing in this long line, I'm getting more and more notifications on my phone about, like, oh, this big Microsoft bug, or what later became known as the CrowdStrike bug, blah, 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 blah. This is all going on. And I'm like, okay, I need to absolutely extend my stay in this room for another night before, like, that's not even an option, because it was booking up fast. So once I got up to the front, I basically said, can I do that? And they were like, yeah, we can do that. And I'm glad I did it when I did it, because, like, I was price tracking. The prices in the hotel, like, shot up, like, you know, like, I don't know, maybe 100 to 200% just in, like, a few hours later, because they were running out of rooms. And, like, this is how desperate people were. That's like a 20-story hotel, and people were willing to walk up the stairs in that because there was no other options. It was absolutely insane. So once I had rebooked the room, somebody finally mentioned, oh, by the way, we've opened up the service elevator so that people can use that, which, of course, the service elevator sucks. It takes hours, and people actually got stuck on it. But whatever, I had a room. So I was fine. And it actually worked out, because I ended up hanging out with a few people from my Discord server, which you should totally join if you're not in there, that happened to be in Vegas at the same time. So we actually had some fun of it. We made good on the situation. We even went game hunting.
Nice.
There'll be a video about that. Yeah, we even went game hunting. It'll be fun. So I salvaged that. But keep in mind that I finally flew out of Vegas on what? The 20th? Was it the 20th? Or the 21st? I think it was the 20th.
Was it Saturday or Sunday?
So I left Japan on the 18th, arrived in Newark, what is still technically the 18th, arrived in Vegas on the 19th, was stuck there until the 20th. No, I left there on Sunday, the 21st. So yeah. I intended to be back here on Wednesday the 17th and did not arrive until Sunday the 21st. So I apologize for almost gobbling up like a week extra for this podcast. That was not intended, but that was the hell I went through with that. And a lot of this will be on the Travel Channel, by the way, so you guys can see all of this filmed as it was actually occurring. I think the best part, though, is when I finally landed in Chicago, which was it was like Sunday night, I think, is when I got back. And the first thing I was greeted to when I walked into O'Hare is they have, like, you know, prompters everywhere with screens on them. There was still a bunch of screens with that Windows error where the thing has just not been booted up correctly. Yeah. And I'm like, yep, that's perfect. So the world is still kind of dealing with this at the time of recording. And there were so many memes made about, like, oh, hey guys, I just got a job at CrowdStrike, gonna show some initiative and put out an update today. But man, that was my story with all that. I don't know if you had anything go on with you, but that was my time.
Yeah, like, the only thing that happened with me is that I woke up and saw a text from, like, my work's IT department being like, hey, if you're on a Windows machine and you can't boot because of reasons, call us to get the BitLocker key, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I would almost think it would be spam, except for the part where they actually, like, knew what the internal name of, like, our basically ticket platform was. And so then eventually, like, I went up, got to work because I'm on a MacBook, so I was fine. I basically just worked that day. And it's like, oh, Windows computers are Y2K. Okay.
Mm-hmm. To be fair, it was only ones that had CrowdStrike software installed to begin with. So It was really just, you know, company rigs. It wasn't like home users really, for the most part, wouldn't have been affected.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
my PC was fine.
You know? Exactly, same. Because I don't do that. But there are people, again, in my Discord that are like techs, you know, repair. Like, that's their day job. And they were all saying it's like one of the worst days they've ever had to deal with, because the fix itself, once it was figured out what it was, you have to do it like one at a time. You can't just there's no
physical access to the machine. Yeah,
precisely. And so they're like, it was one of these situations where, you know, I had to physically drive out to all these places and do all this because, you know, good luck getting on the phone with like a doctor, you know, and trying to explain to him how to do this like software update into safe modes. Like, that's not their expertise. They've got their expertise. They're here for you to do that. So most of them couldn't do it themselves. So a lot of the tech guys, who are usually not the most social of types, were the ones being forced to drive out to all these places and deal with this. Like, at the time we're recording this is still very much a thing. United has mostly recovered. I know Delta is still dealing with this really bad. Hilariously, Southwest Airlines, because they still use a kernel of like Windows 3.1 or something.
Yeah, I read
they
that.
were immune to it because their software is so archaic. It was built in like 1992.
Yeah,
and
they can't use CrowdStrike, so they're fine.
Yeah, they were ironically fine, which was hilarious because you remember a couple of years ago, like their system got overloaded from down around Christmas, and like all their flights were canceled because their whole system revolved around like notepads and stuff. But they were ironically immune here because they were so old. It kind of reminded me of like Battlestar Galactica. I don't know if you ever watched the Battlestar Galactica remake from like 2003, where the Cylons are like, "Hey, we're gonna take over humanity," and like they had integrated all their software into all the computer systems, and they were able to just shut down the entire defense grid. And the only one that survived was the Battlestar Galactica because it was so old and archaic it wasn't compatible with the update. It was like the same, like, hey, they were kind of the heroes, they survived. But yeah.
Now,
so that was my horrific journey. How are you?
I mean, like I said, I was fine. I just had a normal work day. But I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, like, how the hell could something like this even happen? And as a software developer, I have bad news for you. It's not that it's not surprising that something like this happened. I'm more surprised something like this doesn't happen more often. Like, one thing that some people like don't necessarily realize is that a lot of the software systems that we all rely on, they're held together with the digital equivalent of duct tape and chewing gum.
Yeah, that doesn't shock me at all.
Yeah. So, like I said, I'm a software developer myself, and we've had like issues where we think things are okay, we push an update, it breaks. Why didn't it catch it? Because someone said they did this, and turns out that they did it wrong. They didn't validate that stuff worked in non-prod correctly, or it's a bug that was actually just specific to prod, or someone forgot to change the prod configuration to match the new QA configuration. Sometimes the automated pipeline that runs the test that should have just been like, this is broken. Don't use this. Yeah, you have to fix it. Just doesn't work correctly, and the test passed somehow. Like, it's really nuts, honestly.
Yeah, and it's cowboy coding, right?
Mm-hmm. And in this case in particular, like, as I was talking about, like, CrowdStrike basically made their software as a hardware driver, despite the fact that they're not actually making hardware that interfaces with the computer. The thing is that usually with hardware drivers, Microsoft certifies them, and this was certified. But what happened is that the update that got pushed was like loading the file that the driver reads. So as far as Microsoft was concerned, the driver didn't change, so it didn't have to be recertified. So nothing needed to be checked on Microsoft's end. But the data file that was actually pushed was bad and triggered a bug or something that then made all this happen. So I'm not sure if that was just something that Microsoft didn't know was happening there, or if they knew it was possible to happen, but at the same time didn't think anyone would do it, or what. I don't know if they're going to change their standards to make it that the driver can't just like load stuff from other files anymore. I'm not entirely sure where things are going to go from here. One thing I do know, though, is that any of CrowdStrike's competitors are probably really happy right now.
Oh, yeah. Like, there's no way they are going to just not change. Because the thing is, Microsoft is brunting the blame for this, regardless of though they had nothing really to do with it. Like, I mean, this is like, I'm not trying to talk politics, but this is even like, gotten into geopolitics. Like, the Chinese were coming out and being like, see, we're so much better because, we have our own version, not Windows, and our systems are all fine. And, like, this is this was bad. Like, you know, I assume that Microsoft themselves is going to try to insulate from this type of automatic update. CrowdStrike might be like done as a company after this. Like, this was
depends
so
on like how badly
devastating.
they get sued and how bad like the actual damages were, and how many people died because of hospital stuff not working.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like, it's going to be a while before this is sorted out. But like the class action lawsuit against CrowdStrike from so many corporations and so many individuals over this. Like, they're done. Like, nobody who would ever invest in or trust CrowdStrike after this. Like, why would you? Their whole point is computer security, right? And they just literally like bricked like every computer that used their stuff. So like, yeah, they're done. And as far as quality control on Microsoft's end, to like, I'm sure it was nice to just be able to not have to, you know, necessarily add an extra layer of red tape. Now you kind of see why sometimes that's necessary. So, you know, it is what it is. Because I know we all want our updates as quickly as possible, just so that if there is a problem, you know, you whatever. But sometimes it's better to kind of double check on something, especially somebody else's work. But yeah, hindsight's 20/20, obviously, and I don't work in the tech industry like that, so I can't say it. But I don't know. That's just how I feel from an outsider's perspective. And to be fair, my situation was annoying. But I didn't get hurt. I didn't die. Like you said it yourself. There were people who died as a result of this because medical equipment was non-functional. Like, that's bad, dude. That's really bad.
Yeah. So
yeah. Oof. Anyway, let's go into something a little more optimistic. So thank you, Spencer, for sort of not really picking that subject, but we did it in your honor. Hopefully the reason you didn't respond to us had nothing to do with CrowdStrike destroying your computer. Okay, moving on. So next up is Sinjit, who is another backer, and he's at the level in which he gets to pick a subject as well. He basically just kind of had one of these like alternate history type of questions, because I think he just kind of loves those. His question was, what if Shenmue wasn't made? Would Sega still be making consoles? Or in a magical universe where Shenmue doesn't exist, it means automatically they are still making consoles. Which version of reality would you prefer? Before I obviously go into this, do you have any sort of take on this question?
Well, for the first one, for at least the first version of it, I can very easily say that no, Sega would still not be making consoles.
I completely agree.
Shenmue cost a lot of money. It didn't cost Kill Sega money. I don't think.
That is correct. No, you're completely right. I'll break down that in a bit, but I'll let you do your point first.
Yeah, but as for the other one where Shenmue doesn't happen, therefore Sega magically somehow still creates consoles, I actually don't know. Like, I mean, I haven't actually played through all of Shenmue. I tried it a couple times and bounced off. But, to be fair, I bounced off them like years after they came out. Like, it's not like so it's just like, I could play something else that gives me the same vibes or whatever. Plus, I think when I first tried it, like, on the PC version, it was bugged at the time and stuff didn't work. So it's like, I'll get back to this later, and then never did.
Yeah, that happened.
But in that hypothetical universe, like, I mean, I guess by now, if Sega was still making consoles, I'd be buying them. But that hypothetical universe means I don't play Sega games during the 6th generation, because I got a PS2 and I got a GameCube in that gen. My parents were not going to buy me a third console for that time. I was still a kid back then.
So you didn't have a Dreamcast? You didn't have a Dreamcast?
I did not have a Dreamcast. Like, I did actually ask for one at some point, and my parents were like, I don't know. And then my dad managed to get a PS2. And then, like, immediately, and then after that, like, then Sega, like, ended up not... Basically, then went third party. I was like, oh, thank God I didn't actually get a Dreamcast then, because then I wouldn't have been able to get the GameCube. And I got the GameCube because Capcom put exclusive Resident Evil games on it. So I was like, well, and so like my mom first was like, when she first heard that I wanted a game, she was like, you have a game console on. It's like, well, the Resident Evil games are going exclusive to the GameCube for now. And it's just like, I want to play them. It's like, okay, that makes sense. And then eventually I did get one as my middle school graduation present. Mm-hmm. But there would have been no way I would have gotten a third one then. So the only time I would have been able to buy, I would have had to wait until I was like actually making my own money before I could have bought a Sega console. And when my last Sega console was the Sega Genesis, I'm not entirely sure if I would have immediately jumped back on ship. I mean, by the time the 7th generation was like towards the end, I probably would have, because at that point I bought an Xbox 360. But then again, then in 8th gen, I didn't buy an Xbox One, and I only got an Xbox Series X, because when I bought a new laptop, it came with Game Pass, and it's like, okay, I'll keep Game Pass for a while, but honestly, I might as well, since I have the spare money, I might as well get the Xbox Series X so I can have access to all of Game Pass. Like, that's literally the only reason why I have the Series X now, and it's basically just been sitting underneath my entertainment center this whole time, because most of the time it's just like, well, whatever, most of what I was interested to play on Game Pass was on PC, so why would I bother? So
yeah, that's fair.
So, basically, this universe is potentially the one where I didn't play any of the Sonic games until, like, maybe Sonic... Well, not even then, because if I don't end up buying a Sega console in that timeline, then I don't play anything past Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Well, no, wait, no, I'm wrong. Sonic 3D Blast.
Strange choice, but okay.
No, I mean, that would have been the last Sonic game I would have got in one where I can only play it on a Sega console, because I didn't have a Saturn, I didn't have a Dreamcast.
Right. Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. So from my perspective, obviously this is aimed more at me because it's more of a personal question to me. To the former point about, if Shenmue wasn't made, would Sega still be making consoles? I'm completely with you. No, that would not have changed anything. There is this ridiculous misconception that Shenmue was like this financial hindrance that broke Sega, because people often throw out there, oh, the game cost $80 million and that was the most expensive game ever and they just couldn't afford it. Few points. Running a console, like, to actually manage that is something that costs in excess of billions of dollars. Like, 80 million is a drop in the bucket compared to what it overall costs. In fact, Sega's primary backer, I forget the guy's name offhand, he's a Japanese guy, he was like their number one angel investor. He was like a billionaire that was just putting in his own money to keep Sega afloat. Had nothing to do with Shenmue. That guy died, and then like a week later, Sega had to bow out. Like, that's what did it. Mm-hmm. It had nothing to do with Shenmue. Now, that said, Shenmue didn't actually cost $80 million. It was an American marketing ploy, because that was one of the few things they understood about the game, was that it cost a lot to make. So they were like, let's just make up a number and say that's how much it cost. So they were like, it costs $80 million to make this game, which it did not. The total for Shenmue's budget was actually $47 million, which is nothing to scoff at, but at the same time, it tends to ignore the fact that people look at that and go, oh, so Shenmue 1 cost $47 million. No. Shenmue, everything that it ever was, Shenmue 2, Shenmue 1, Shenmue Saturn, Virtua Fighter RPG, The Old Man and the Peach Tree, all that stuff that Yu Suzuki was working on that eventually evolved into Shenmue, the combined budget of all of that was $47 million. So if you actually break that down by game to game, it's like Shenmue 1 probably only cost upwards of maybe like $10 million by itself, and it certainly was not this like straw that broke the camel's back or anything. And I certainly don't think that, they would have been making consoles if they hadn't made that game. Like, that's just, I mean, we were just talking about it. Activision, $68 billion acquisition. Like, we are not talking the same ballpark here. So that said, in the hypothetical scenario where I'm like Thanos and I can just will Sega into making consoles with all the Infinity Stones at the sacrifice of Shenmue, I approach that from two different perspectives. The Shenmue fan in me obviously is not going to take that deal, because those games mean way too much to me, and I kind of like the track we went on. And even the other side of me that's like, well, wouldn't that be kind of neat? I also know where gaming has gone generally since the 6th generation, and I think that had Sega stuck it out, they would have inevitably been forced to go into the same direction that Sony, Microsoft, and maybe even specifically Nintendo had to go, which is you were either going to stick with Microsoft and Sony's approach, where you kind of approach it as like, we're a technological conglomerate and we're going to make sure our device does a whole bunch of things all at once, not just play games. I don't think that was in Sega's heart. So I think Sega probably would have gone more the Nintendo route, where they would have gone in like a corner and they probably would have done something gimmicky like the Wii. The idea of Sega making a console akin to the garbage dumpster fire that was the Wii breaks my heart as just a thought. So no, I would not want that. Them coming out and making a successor a la the Wii U, which is actually a great system, but fails spectacularly, would have been really hard and embarrassing to defend. And then if they even survived all that, getting to their version of the Switch would have been cool. But I sit here at the age of 37, and while I acknowledge a lot of things about the Switch are great, I simply am not that nostalgic for it, and nothing about it really excites me enough to like try to collect for it or buy for it or really get behind it, because the best game experiences on it are still the ones made by Nintendo, and everything else is just like, well, it's got a portable version of that game, so that's cool. But if you don't value portability, then it doesn't mean much to you. So if I had to think of Sega going either the direction that Sony and Microsoft did or the direction Nintendo did, I would be very depressed. So no, I would rather keep my Shenmue in either one of those mindsets of either the Shenmue fan or the general video game fan. But that's me. Obviously, a lot of people would prefer if there was this Sega equivalent of the Switch competitor still around. I just feel like we would have lost a lot of charm in that. Part of what gives Sega its appeal today is just it was such a time capsule from a very specific era. I mean, if you think about it, Sega really only made consoles for like 15 years. From like 1983 to basically 1998, 1999. Okay, so a little bit longer, maybe more like 16, 17 years if you want to include when the Dreamcast technically ended in like 2001 is basically when they stopped hardware production. So that's 18 years or so. And that's if we're ignoring things like the fact that the Sega Master System is still produced in Brazil, etc.
Well, yeah.
But 18 years. I mean, dude, think about what it was 18 years ago was what, 2006? And I'm sure you fondly remember 2006. It wasn't that long ago in your mind. So it really was just kind of this short gap of time where Sega produced all this kind of hardware and all these experiences that really got us all so excited about it. And in a like a nostalgic, charming kind of way, I kind of want to keep it there. I kind of want to keep it in that box of time, rather than have them play out that story for too long to the point where we start to hate them. Even though, I'm going to use another analogy here. Even though I like The Simpsons still, to most people, The Simpsons is something that should have ended after like season 7 or 8. It's on season 36. So to a lot of people, The Simpsons was a very good microcosm of time that overstayed its welcome. And I feel like that's what would have happened to Sega. Me personally. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, probably, like, whenever anyone thinks of Sega, obviously when they're thinking back on it, like, they don't necessarily think of Sega, like, as they are now, where they're just publishing games. It's like, oh yeah, they own Yakuza / Like a Dragon. Oh yeah, there's a new Sonic. Okay. But when they think of Sega's identity, they think of, like, the 90s Sega Genesis era type stuff, where they had all those, like, ads that they were doing against Nintendo, because that's where Sega actually got a lot of us. But your comment about, like, Sega basically having to go off and do their own thing like Nintendo does make me wonder, in this hypothetical timeline, like, how long does Sega actually, like, last as a console manufacturer? And does Sega also be in there kill Nintendo?
Well, see, that's the, obviously none of us could possibly know the answer to that. But I would basically say, let's argue for the purposes of our hypothetical that we had a different console universe where basically, so you know how Sony and Microsoft are often thought of as just kind of being the same thing, but just slightly different. Mm-hmm. I would say we'd also have that, and then on the flip side, we'd have the Sega and Nintendo. They're the same thing, but slightly different. And I don't think that either of them would have competed with the same kind of game-driven heart that Sega and Nintendo did in the 90s, just because they would have understood it was a different world.
Right.
And so, like, people tend to give a lot of guff to Nintendo because of their lack of certain support of things. Like, with the exception of the Panasonic Q, which wasn't even actually made by Nintendo, it was made by Panasonic, Nintendo has never once released a home console capable of supporting music CDs, DVDs, or Blu-rays. Think about that for a second.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know exactly why, because when you think about it, like, I mean, the GameCube had that mini disc, the mini DVD disc drive, so it couldn't really have done DVDs anyway, other than, just putting a DVD drive in it, like with the Panasonic Q. But by the time the Wii came about, it's like, well, why would we put a DVD player in this? Everyone has a PS2.
But that's kind of my point, is just like, for Sega to basically have competed with Nintendo in that sort of environment, they would have had to create what would have looked like an inferior product, kind of the way the Wii looked like an inferior product compared to the PS3 and 360, because frankly it was. Set aside my personal hatred of that machine because of its gimmicky, stupid controller, it, from a technical perspective, was objectively less capable. It was basically just a GameCube on steroids. Now, that was never the issue I had with it. It was really boiled down to its controller. But to see Sega have to do something like that, where they're like, look, it'll be successful, it'll make us money, but you kind of lose your self-respect in it by basically saying, like, the only reason Nintendo survived that transition is because they were willing to take your grandmother's money. Because they were willing to take your mom and aunts and sisters' money. And this is nothing against women, obviously, anybody can be a gamer. But the point is, like, the people who are not gamers, the atypical audience, was who Nintendo intentionally appealed to in that generation. It made them a ton of money in the short run, but also bit them when it got to the Wii U. I've talked about that 1,000 times because that audience didn't go with them. And for Nintendo, I get it. But if Sega had done that, I would have been embarrassed. I would have been embarrassed if, like, I'd been growing up defending him, being that one outsider kid who was always a Sega kid. Granted, I didn't have a Saturn at the time, but like being that guy and then seeing them make like this console for your grandmother, I'd be like, this betrays like everything I thought I knew. You know what I mean? And so it's kind of like, I mean, this is going to be a sports reference here, but it's like, okay, I grew up in Chicago. I live here now. I grew up in the Michael Jordan 90s Bulls era. And we're always going to fantasize about what would have happened if after the Last Dance season, Jordan and the whole gang had got together and done it once again. Yeah, maybe they could have won title number 7. Maybe it could have been magical. Or he could have gone out like LeBron James, where he's just too old to play this game anymore. He routinely gets bumped out of the playoffs, and he's no longer the GOAT. He's just kind of playing in the league still. We kind of saw that with the Michael Jordan Wizards era. And we tend to forget it even happened, because we give Michael a pass, because that's how much we loved him. But, like, I don't know if I would want to see the Sega go out like that. I think part of what makes the Dreamcast so beloved now, and I'm going to kind of take this a bit from Shane Rerez, said this to me once very well. He said, part of what makes people love the Dreamcast is that it's unique because it's the only video game console in history that stopped because the company was out of money, even though the system was good. Every other console that failed because the games sucked, the products sucked, and there wasn't enough going into it. The Dreamcast had everything going for it. They just ran out of cash. Because as I said, most of their money came from an angel investor. Shenmue didn't do them any immediate favors. That is true. But, like, even in the most extreme case scenario, Shenmue had maybe sped up the death of the Dreamcast by, like, a couple weeks at best. Keep in mind, what truly ended the Dreamcast was the death of the billionaire angel investor who was keeping the system alive, not Shenmue. So I don't think I would really want to see where Sega would have gone, because when we know how the rest of the industry went, I think I'd be kind of embarrassed to see them in that.
But then again, like what I was saying too, like in a world where Sega and Nintendo, like in the 7th generation and onward, basically go off and do their own thing and basically end up occupying the same niche, I don't necessarily see both of them being able to survive.
I actually agree with you. I think that most likely in that scenario, Nintendo probably would have won out. The Wii probably would have still defeated whatever Sega produced. I mean, I'm a huge Sega guy, and even I will be the first to admit they never won a generation, ever. The closest they ever came to that was the Genesis, and they still lost it pretty handedly to Nintendo overall. And that was largely and ironically because they couldn't win the Japanese market. But they beat the N64 with the Saturn, but they both lost to the PlayStation hand over fist. So I think that rather than have Sega go out on the Dreamcast, which has kind of cemented their legacy as this great console manufacturer that just ran out of money, but delivered all these unbelievable experiences in such a relatively short period of time, if they had made their own version of the equivalency of the Wii and had it fail, and that's what we went out on, they would not be revered. Like, okay, technically this happened, by the way. You ever heard of the Sega Bina?
Only from mentions in your videos.
Exactly. That's good. So if you've ever been out there, if you've ever heard of the Sega Pico, Sega made a competitor, well, not even a competitor. They basically mutated a Sega Genesis into a child-friendly toy called the Sega Pico. It's like this really obscure machine they made. It was very popular in Japan. They brought it to the West. I own some of the American versions. You can find them. But it's just a child's early development learning toy.
Yeah, it's a
console. It is a console. Yeah, it's a Leapfrog Plus almost. What most people don't know is that in 2007, well after the Dreamcast was done, Sega in Japan only made a new console called the Sega Bina, which was effectively the next-gen version of the Sega Pico. And it sucked. You know, it was a child's early development system. It's not something that I would exactly expect to be a huge hit, despite the fact that Pico actually did make a bunch of money for them. And ironically, is the only time Nintendo ever made games for Sega hardware, by the way, was both the Pico and the Bina. They put Pokemon games on there. But regardless, if they had made something like that, you know, like they had put out like some piece of junk like the Wii, and they called it, you know, the Sega whatever, maybe they called it the Bina, who knows, in that timeline. And that's how we remembered them, with this last piece of junk system, that would be embarrassing. So I'm just glad, honestly, that didn't happen, because the Sega we all kind of fondly remember as being innovative and creative and having all these ideas and trying so much was largely born of a lot of freak circumstances that would never have been repeated now, and frankly wouldn't work now. So they would have had to have followed market trends, which likely would have led them to their own demise, because they weren't very good at that. Their history of just abandoning their hardware in favor of something else, they weren't going to sustain it. Basically, they're a company that got really like into the idea of having their own home arcade stuff, and they failed every single time except for the Genesis, which was unexpected. And even that caused massive division and cannibalization where they couldn't decide on the future of the platform. This is why you got the Sega CD. It's why you got the 32X. It's ultimately why you got the split with the Saturn. And their unified effort at the Dreamcast was the only time they were totally unified on a platform. They just ran out of money. I'd rather remember them that way, but that's me.
Yeah, like I said, I didn't have a Dreamcast growing up, but I'm sure that if the Sega, the last Sega system was not as beloved as the Dreamcast was, I wouldn't have cared as much, because the only Sega consoles I had were Sega before, you know, I started, you know, being a retro collector and actually bought the rest of them, for the most part. Was the Genesis and, you know, the Game Gear. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can even look at some other examples. Like, look at Atari. They were the most beloved video game companies ever. How did they go out? You can kind of argue the Jaguar if you want. And technically, you could even argue the VM Labs Nuon, which really was just Atari under a different name. Would you want that to have been Sega's legacy, where that's how it ended?
Absolutely not.
Exactly. Even though technically Sega did do this with the Bina, we can all give that one a pass, like we do Michael Jordan.
The Bina wasn't meant to be a game console. It was meant to be a new, updated Pico.
That's exactly my point. Just like the Jordan Wizards weren't meant to be a championship team. They were just Jordan racking up some points. That's my point. That's different. So, yeah. Anything else to say on this?
Nope, I think I'm good.
All right. Well, then, Joseph, thank you very much for joining us here, as always. And now I have a round of shout-outs. So the following people are Patreon backers, and they are at the tier in which they get a shout-out. So if you would like to join anytime, I appreciate the support. You've got Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, and Trey Wagner. Once again, that is Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, and Trey Wagner. Thank you so much, as always, for your support. And Joseph, as always, thank you so much for joining me. And we're back. We are now joined by Abdullah, reigning champion. Welcome back, dude.
Hey, happy to be back. And
Well,
probably happy that Adam's still alive.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked a bit about that in the first half. CrowdStrike. Thanks, CrowdStrike. But anyway, but yes, I appreciate your support. But yeah, we will just jump into it here because I've learned not to waste so much time based on my experiences out everywhere. But yes, okay. So, Abdullah is of course a backer who gets to be on the podcast, which means he also gets to pick a subject. And you wanted to pick a subject that I think is a holdover from a different podcast where you wanted to talk about this. So I'm just I'll introduce the subject and then let you kind of explain yourself. Basically, what you said to me, this is aimed at collectors. How do you balance between an item's rarity versus its condition and which has the edge over the other? And what I assume you mean by that is when you find something you want, do you pick it based on its rarity? Do you pick it based on its condition? If you see something you want but it's in bad condition, do you still get it because it's rare? Or does it have to be perfect and you don't care about how rare it is, etc.? But I'll let you kind of elaborate.
I happen to have I wouldn't say large or big, but a good Dreamcast collection. I have a couple of the editions. So one of those would be the Code Veronica edition, the red one, unfortunately not the blue one. And I happen to have both Hello Kitty versions. So, and they're all complete in box, good condition. I got them years back. They weren't as expensive as they are now. So I happen to have a story with the Code Veronica one, which is the one I told Adam about. But the one that is more interesting is the Hello Kitty, which I literally just remembered the story. So I don't plan on selling those. They're mine, but there was an offer from someone locally who wanted to buy it, and he was like, "Can you send me the photos?" And I was like, "Okay." I mean, if he's gonna offer a good price, maybe I'll think about it, because life happens and that sort of stuff. So on the Code Veronica one, I also had the same situation, and I was lowballed on the price for that one. Somebody was attempting to lowball me on the price, and according to this person, actually that person is a big collector here, probably owns way more than I do. And what really surprised me is that they kind of saw that there was a little bit, so in the Hello Kitty version of the Dreamcast, that one, the box isn't so great, and so they lowballed the price to less than $100 for a complete in-box one, because of the little bit of
terrible
wear on the edge of the box. And with the Code Veronica one, they said, "Oh, there's a little scratch on the console," and they lowballed me for about $60. They said I'll buy it for $60. I'm trying to estimate here, because we deal in dirham, but I'm trying to kind of estimate that.
Yeah, the currency conversion, I know.
Yeah, so essentially the highest offer was that after a bit of here and there, it didn't go higher than $100. Obviously, to me, that was, I'm not going to sell that, obviously. I'm looking for how much it goes for. And I'm not saying here that I'm going for eBay price, but eBay prices or prices or like price charting or whatever. No, I'm trying to say that, okay, it makes sense, okay? There's been, collecting is getting bigger. I got these back when they were cheap. Now that's not the market price and all of that. So this is kind of the general overview of what happened. Obviously, to explain the details would be too long, but that got me into thinking. Eventually, I have those Dreamcasts. I mean, I'm not planning to sell them anyway, but I just thought maybe if the offer was good, I'll think about it.
Sure.
And
Just to give the audience a little bit of a parameter here, just for 1 second, if you'll indulge me. The Code Veronica Dreamcast that he was being offered $60 for in the box, you can check eBay yourselves. The last couple that sold were console only, and they were selling for like $400, $500. With the box, the asking price is usually around $3,000. I bet you could probably get around $2,000. So to be offered $60 is, to say the least, insulting. Okay, go on.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's it. So even the Hello Kitty one, I didn't mention this one to you, Adam, the Hello Kitty one, but that one is even crazier because that one, to me, that was kind of the shocker because the Hello Kitty one, the guy was really serious in buying it. It was, those people that keep annoying you sometimes. Oh, give it to me. Oh, give it. I want it. I'll take it. And they keep annoying you. You're like, no, dude, your offer isn't good, and I'm not planning to sell it anyway unless I get a really good offer, and that's a whole other mess. So I got into thinking. So that guy, their reasoning for lowballing was mainly the condition. So, but in my head, I was thinking, if an item is rare or hard to find, like those consoles here, I'm pretty sure you can't run into those consoles in the wild as easy as, common stuff, obviously. Is it really that the condition, small little condition changes affect the price if the rarity is high? So let's just say Panzer Dragoon Saga on the Saturn, right? If you get one with a broken case, does that mean that it can go like 60%, 70% less than what the market is? I don't really think so, because running into the actual thing is very difficult. So the condition might make the price lower, but I don't think that the condition is as powerful as the rarity. Now that's my point of view. For example, things like on the NES or the N64 cartridge only obviously will not be the same as with the box, but at the same time, running into it by itself is rare. So to me, I think it goes rarity, then condition, in principle. And if it's a common item, the condition only matters, because common,
that's an interesting
kind of rarity is. That's what I think of it. So
I'm gonna say
that's essentially.
I'm gonna say I agree with you. I think that there's an interesting parallel there, because rarity, if an item is rare that you organically find, you're willing to put up with certain conditional flaws, whether it's scuffs, marks, whatever it is, because you understand how uncommon this thing is to find. But on the flip side, I think if an item is common, you have a greater desire to get a better conditioned version of it just because you'll see it again. So that parallel makes complete sense to me. The better question is, what is the tolerance for that? And particularly, I'm not going to focus on the common side of things, because I think we're both on the same page. If like Super Mario Brothers on NES, there's 100 million copies of that game out there, you're going to find the one you want. When it comes to the rare items, it really boils down to the type of collector you are and the type of budget you have. So to use your particular example, with Panzer Dragoon Saga, if the case was broken, that's not really a big deal. You can replace the case. That's sure, it's an annoyance, and you could probably squeeze a small discount out of somebody, unless they themselves also know exactly what it is, and they're like, dude, I'm willing to swap it out with a sports game case if that means an extra $100 in my pocket. Like, anybody would do that. It's when you get into like obscure hardware or something like that, I guess it's like if you find like a console that's like, a rare machine, like if you found like an Apple Pippin somewhere or something like that, and you found it but the disk drive didn't work, you're like, well, okay, it's hard to find this machine, but it needs maintenance. That is worth a discount, but it's still something that you probably want to pick up, but knowing full well you're going to go into it being like, I have to get work done to it. If it's purely cosmetic, though, like if you found a Pippin and like, I don't know, half of the system was like smashed in or something, like the case is physically broken, would you still want it despite its rarity? And that's when you start going like, I don't know. So it depends on the item, I think, and it depends on the type of collector, because I have known collectors in my time that are like, no, I only want it if it's like absolutely perfect. And that's fair enough. It's everybody's got their own like collecting rules. But I don't know. I sit there and I think like, what item would I be willing to buy? How rare would it have to be for me to completely forego my concern of its condition? So like, for example, and this is a ridiculous extreme, but this is kind of the point I'm making. Like, let's say for argument's sake, you and I, we finish up the podcast today, and then, you know, I finish working, and then I'm like, all right, you know, I got some time on my hands. I'm going to drive out to a Goodwill and just kind of see if I find anything. And I walk in there, and for some reason, there's a Sega Pluto in there. Not the one that I'm carrying around, just another one. But like, it's clearly like been beat up, like it's been caved in, somebody hit it, you know, whatever. And they're still asking like $100 for it. Do I buy it? Yes, because it is literally like the rarest thing you could possibly get in that scenario, even though it's completely destroyed. But if I were to walk in and find like the Hello Kitty Dreamcast, $100, but it's console only, and again, the case is all broken up, it's smashed in, would I buy it? No. It's
yeah,
like
I mean, in that scenario, definitely. I agree.
Yeah, that's my point, though. Like, you have to, the amount of, I guess you could almost think of this as a mathematical equation. Higher level of rarity equals higher tolerance for poor condition, because there's only so many of the rarer items out there. Whereas lower or higher amount of items, lower amount of rarity, if you will, means a lower tolerance for poor condition. So again, if something is mass produced, and you know, again, we're gonna go with, like, if I wanted a Nintendo Wii for some reason, there are so many of those, and they're so easy to get. There's no reason, unless you're just truly being cheap, to buy a junk one. You know, you just go out, you can find a good condition one for relatively cheap, probably like $20 at this point. Or if you really wanted to, you could buy like a yellowed nasty one for like $3. Yeah, I'm willing to pay the extra $17 or whatever to have it in good shape, because there's a million of those things. Well, there actually is literally 100 million of those things. But yeah, you get where I'm going with this. Go on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would say, yeah. I mean, so because when in the scenario that I faced, it didn't make sense to me why somebody would try and lowball the price. Maybe they want to resell it. Maybe that's their strategy. Maybe they think that, you know, that I'm selling it for someone and I don't know what the thing is that I'm selling, and so on and so forth. But I would agree definitely that there is some sort of tolerance. For example, when you mentioned the Pippin, I actually also at the same time I thought of the Virtual Boy. I mean, I think some people would buy a Virtual Boy that's broken, but they would go, the price would not be cheap. Nobody's gonna sell you even a Virtual Boy that is a junk piece if it's physically in good condition.
It's just a mathematical equation is basically what we're talking about here. It's, you know, the rarer something is, the higher tolerance you have for poor condition. Let's be clear about something in case the audience isn't quite following it. What he's basically saying here is he has a Resident Evil Red Claire Dreamcast in the box. The box is slightly dinged. The console is slightly dinged. And for that, the guy wanted like a 98% discount on it, which is ridiculous. Now, if the console had no box, it was console only, and as we keep saying, it was smashed in, maybe the guy would have a case. But he doesn't. He's just a guy asking you for a ridiculous discount. Presumably, he's either an idiot or he thinks you are. So that's ridiculous. But if it was like a standard white Dreamcast out of the box and there was nothing else about it, $60 might actually be decent. But for a special limited edition one, that's absurd. So that's just one of those things, you just throw that in your junk bin. Like, I get YouTube comments a lot from people who watch my videos and then decide they want the thing in the video. And sometimes they make offers, but they're like stupid. So like the other day, I did a video once on my complete Wii U collection, and some guy said, let me borrow Tekken. And I was just like, you can borrow it forever from eBay. Like, why would I mail you my copy of Tekken so you could just try it out? That's not how this works. But yeah, people just do stuff like that, dude. And it's best to kind of roll your eyes and just move on with your day.
Yeah, but it's I thought it would be an interesting thing to see, maybe what people think of that. Like, how do they
I agree.
balance that out?
I actually have an example of that from my recent trip to Japan. So when I went to Japan, I went to one of the worst places in the world. What do you guys call it? Akihabara. I hate that place, FYI. If you've never been there and you have this fantasy of it being like some nerd paradise, it sucks. I just want everybody to know that.
Because I've never been there.
Location.
But
I'm telling you, and I'm telling everybody who's listening.
I haven't really been
Akihabara is for Akihabara is for idiots. I'm just going to say it. Akihabara is for idiots. Its primary appeal, it's a very touristy area. In Japan, you can always tell if a place sucks if there's a ton of white people around. I'll just be honest. There's tons of white people walking around Akihabara. That place sucks. And it's always like the same stupid people who are like, oh, this is so crazy. I've never seen anime before. You're like, shut up. Just shut up. Shut up. Sit down. Shut up. Like, that's just what you want to tell everyone in that area. But yeah, so if you're into anime and the spectacle, fine. You might get something out of Akihabara. I am speaking to you now, not only you, Abdullah, but to everyone else listening. If you're into retro video games, which you probably are if you're listening to this, Akihabara is not the place you want to go. But on my trip, I kind of ran out of stuff to do. And so one day I just decided there is something I need to look for. Akihabara is a reasonable destination considering that I don't have a car and I have no other ability to get out further, and frankly it's so hot that there's not a whole lot of options. So I'm going to go into Akihabara against all my better angels and better instincts, and I'm going to look for this thing, which FYI I never found. But Akihabara mostly has very bad game stores that are extraordinarily overpriced. There is only one store there that I would actually consider decent at this point, and unfortunately it's closing. It's a store called Friends, which is a weird name for a video game store. It's actually run by this elderly couple, and they're clearly like a holdover from a different era. But it's closing at the end of August, so it doesn't even matter by the time most of you have listened to this. And when I went in there, I saw two things. One was I saw an item I had wanted, which is what we'll get back to. But I also saw this guy, a white dude, of course, talking to his Japanese girlfriend or Japanese wife, I'm not really sure. And this will give you a sense of the intellectual caliber of the people walking around Akihabara looking for video games. Because I'll tell you right now, if you go to Akihabara for video games, you're going to be very disappointed because all the stuff that's there, like, it has it, but it's always going to be like 10 times more expensive than it would be just like a single train ride further away. It's a stupid place to buy video games for stupid people. It's not a good place to go. But I went in there anyway. And so as I'm standing in Friends, again, the only decent store there, I hear this guy trying to impress, again, his girlfriend or fiance or wife or whatever. And he said the following quote that has burrowed its way into my brain, possibly given me a tumor, and now all of you need to hear it. He said, and I quote, "So back in the day, Yu Suzuki created Mario for the PlayStation. That's really how video games all started."
What?
That was the quote that came out of this guy trying to impress his girlfriend. And I'm like, this is what I'm talking about. That is the intellectual caliber of video game enthusiasts walking around Akihabara. If you're into anime, go to Akihabara. You'll have fun. But if you're into retro video games, avoid it like a plague. It is not for you. All the places that sell video games there are really just catering to the stupidest of caliber of people like that. People who think they know a lot about the subject, but really have no idea. I mean, that guy was in the best store in Akihabara thinking like, oh man, I'm so into video games, I know what I'm doing. And that was a sentence that came out of his mouth. I just want that.
Yeah, because Mario definitely, I mean, Mario was PlayStation.
Yeah,
God.
Yu Suzuki, famous Sega. Go ahead.
I don't know what to say, honestly.
Yeah, I wanted to jump over the sign and be like, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Like, but I of course didn't do that. But like, he said that. He said Yu Suzuki, which is of course a famous Sega creator, made Mario, which of course is a Nintendo creation, for the PlayStation, which is neither. And that was in the mid-90s. And he said that's where video games started. I wanted to, like, it hurt. That's all I'm trying to say. Nerd rage, right? But that said, that had nothing to do with that specific store. Again, Friends was the only good store in Akihabara, and of course it basically doesn't exist anymore. But point is, I had to weigh rarity of an item versus its condition. And in this case, condition won. So I was thumbing through the GameCube games. Now, when it comes to the GameCube, in Japan, they had like something like 80 exclusive titles that North America never got, or Europe never got. And I'm down to like 3. I'm only missing like 3 of them, right? And they had one. And I was super excited about it, except it was disc only. Now that game happens to be a shoot 'em up called Red Dilogy, or sometimes known as Redurgy. I have it for the Dreamcast, but it came out on the GameCube, but in Japan only. And I think this was only the second time I'd ever even seen it. And this time, though, it was disc only. The price was acceptable for what that game is and how uncommon it is. But I wasn't willing to pick it up disc only. I just wasn't. Because I was like, no, I actually, like, I even had a buddy of mine check on Mercari in Japan and be like, is it possible to find, like, the case and the manual? And they're like, no, there's no listings for that at all. It's either the whole thing or it's not anything. And I'm like, I'm never going to find just the manual and case for this game. It's never going to happen. So I had to pass on it, even though the price point was good. And I know that game is super rare. I've been to Japan 21 times. That's only the second time I've ever seen it. So I passed because in the end I wouldn't have been happy with the purchase. So that's an example of condition beating out rarity. Now, had that been some prototype disc, where it was like this unreleased game or something like that, maybe one of those NR reader discs for the GameCube of like a game that never actually came out or something like that, then of course I would have picked it up. Then the disc only is totally acceptable. But for a retail release that isn't like some special limited edition or like a mistake where the game, like what was it, the NCAA 2013 college basketball for the GameCube where Sega released it and then recalled it immediately. If you only could find a disc of that, it's probably still worth picking up because otherwise you may never get it. Or like NBA Elite 11 for the PS3. If you found that disc only, you'd still pick it up because it's basically an unreleased game. This is a full retail release, just a hard one to find. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Right. So
I agree with that.
Right. And so that's just real world examples of that concept. The balancing, the juggling act between rarity and condition. Sometimes one wins, sometimes the other does. And really, it usually boils down to a simple mathematical equation of the more rare it is, the higher tolerance you will have for poor condition. But also a huge factor is everybody's personal definition of that typically boils down to what type of collector they are. I've heard the term dirty collector before, where they don't really care about condition at all. It's just about having access to the games they want to play. They don't care if they're in cases or manuals. They don't care about any of that. They just want the discs themselves or the carts themselves, and then they're good enough with that. And to be fair, I kind of understand that, because with cartridges, I typically don't care about having a case, a box, or a manual. I just care about having the cart most of the time. Box and manual is nice, not essential. But with discs, I'm like, give me the full thing or I don't want it at all. Right? So we all have our own little rules. All right. So on that note, I think we'll move on from this subject. Abdullah, thank you very much for picking that. And we're going to move on to our next one, which is brought to us by a Patreon backer known as Lodmont. Canonically, within my Discord server lore, he is the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. So naturally, he can afford to pick a subject each month. So thank you very much, Lodmont. So what he wanted us to do is I made a video, like it was my 6th gen recap era videos, which is hard to believe it was like 10 years ago. But he rewatched them recently. And he had recalled something I had mentioned in there about how the 6th generation it was probably my favorite video game generation ever. And in a lot of ways, it was the last generation of basically dedicated game consoles. It also was the foundation of modern day roots of basically video games as a service, video games more as a business. Granted, it was always a business. Let's not kid ourselves. But it was more about it was more about a technological conglomerate now using it as a product in their vast catalog for their market share, as opposed to a company trying to fight its own way and that be their entire thing. And I had made the claim that really kind of started in the 6th generation. He just kind of wanted us to basically revisit that. Do I still feel that way? Was it a good thing? Is all the charm gone now? Can that return? Etc. Do you want to take point on this? Do you want me to do it? How do you feel?
You're talking about the point that they've become more of an entertainment hub that happens to have video games than a device that's meant for video games, right?
Precisely, yes. I argue that really kind of took form in the 6th generation.
Yeah, definitely in the 6th generation, because directly PS2 comes to mind.
It does. I mean, that's the elephant in the room here. So let's just say it. The system that in a lot of ways really took everybody down that path was the PlayStation 2. And it's hard to say that to a lot of people because they interpret that statement as, oh, you're saying the PS2 is bad, which is not at all what we're saying. But it's how people are. They just get very defensive when they hear any negativity towards that particular game system. And this isn't even a negative statement. It's more like I'm simply saying the facts are that system revolutionized the game industry. The debate is whether or not it was good or bad in that sense, if changing the industry was good. In a lot of ways it was. And in some ways you can say it lost its charm. It became less about gaming and more about anything else. So we have to just look up to the history of that point. And for the most part, up to that point, game consoles had been made by dedicated game companies. Your Segas, your Nintendos, your SNKs, Ataris. Now, obviously, there were plenty of exceptions in there. I've done videos on so many of these like freak consoles that came and went and really didn't last very long. NEC, who made a very good game console in the PC Engine, they were a PC company. But they themselves didn't try to do anything other than make a game console. They just said, this is all it's going to do. It's not trying to push our home computer formats. Random one-offs like Commodore was a computer company. They, too, made a game console, the CD32, a spectacular failure. But it was basically just a home computer. But it didn't really do anything to change the direction of the industry. Even Sony with the PS1, the most they tried to do with that was push music CDs a little bit, but they could be forgiven for that because everybody was trying to do that because it was the new hot thing. But even that wasn't really a threat to the overall point of the game industry. The 6th generation is where it really takes shape, where in a sense you have the Dreamcast, which was really the last game console specifically tailor-made and marketed to gamers. And everybody's about to scream about the GameCube. Give me a second. The Dreamcast was the last one that really was marketed to that audience, where you could tell just based on the way they were presenting it, this wasn't intended for children. This wasn't intended for soccer moms. This wasn't intended for your grandmother. This wasn't intended for technology enthusiasts even. It was just intended for people who really like to play video games. That's what the Dreamcast was meant to do. That's what its entire ad campaign was about. And ultimately, as an end product, that's what it existed for. The PlayStation 2, very wisely, I might add, from a financial perspective, said, yes, it's a game console. It's the sequel to the PlayStation. You love your PlayStation? Great. You have more of it now. It plays everything on PlayStation plus its new library of games. It had that side of its campaign, but it also did a very good job of marketing itself as a DVD player. This new upcoming technology where everybody wants to replace their VCRs finally, stop using VHS, and get this new technology that has better movie quality and all that sort of thing. And conveniently, it's got a video game system for little Billy. You don't have to worry about it. But Mom, Dad, this is the one for you. That's a different approach. Now, Microsoft did the same basic thing. They approached it kind of as a DVD player / the future of the internet and computers. They were kind of somewhat going after the PC market a little bit by marketing the Xbox, and Nintendo with the GameCube. I think that people tend to forget in hindsight now, because we all think of the GameCube as this really great console, because it is. It didn't market itself as a game console for gamers. It marketed itself as a children's toy in a separate section, kind of the way Nintendo would eventually market the Wii as its own thing, the Wii U as its own thing, the Switch as its own thing. People forget that Nintendo, while they made competitive hardware, their marketing said, this is for children. So don't worry, you can still have a PlayStation, you can still have an Xbox, but this is for the children in the house. The only reason we care about it so much now is that the children that played it are adults now and remember it very fondly. It's very different. But it wasn't marketed as the sit-down gamers console. And then I guess you can argue the Nuon, which tried the PlayStation 2 approach and just failed spectacularly. And ever since then, every console has been marketed with some sort of gimmick. The Wii was the family-friendly party machine. The 360 was the multimedia machine. The PS3 was the future of Blu-ray and home movies. I mean, that almost killed that system. Remember that? And then PS4... Xbox One, especially the Xbox One, was marketed as just a media device and games were kind of a secondary factor. And then it's hard to argue that people don't kind of hate the Series X, the PS5 especially, because they're just like, everybody keeps saying it's been like 4 years of this and there's still no games that are really that interesting in this generation. The Switch is really marketed as a portable device that plays a bunch of games and that people really love, and anybody can get into it. But it's not even really marketed as a home console. It's marketed more as a handheld that happens to work on your television that's for children of all ages, in a nice way of putting it. So when you think about that stereotypical gamer nerd, where we all have this idea that that person looks like Screech from Saved by the Bell, that the last time anybody marketed a console to that demographic was probably Sega and the Dreamcast. Whereas it's impossible to ignore that the PlayStation 2 changed it, and wisely so, because the Dreamcast sold just a little over 10 million units looking at that demographic, while the PlayStation 2, we now know, sold about 160 million globally, the most successful system in history, by saying, screw that, we're going to appeal to a wider audience. Even though that process, much like you and I were talking about these equations of, rarity versus condition, when you appeal to that many people and approach it to that many people, you do lose a lot of the charm that went with it. You basically are creating one to sacrifice the other because it has to balance out the equation. That does not mean the PlayStation 2 is not a good game console. I am not saying that, though I guarantee that a bunch of you are not listening. You're just deciding that that's the conclusion I'm coming to. But I'm telling you to your faces that's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that from a historical standpoint, everything changed around the PlayStation 2, and it became much more about major companies having their platform be just part of their portfolio. To Microsoft, Xbox is simply a brand. To Sony, PlayStation is simply a brand. Nintendo is probably the most wholesome of the three left, obviously, because it pretty much entirely revolves around the Switch. But to them, it's not about marketing it to traditional gamers anymore, and it hasn't been for a very long time. In fact, I might argue it was never about marketing. Nintendo was pretty much never marketing to traditional gamers. They were always kind of marketing to kids. That's kind of always been their thing. It's just that we get defensive about that because we're like, no, it was always about gamers, but you're remembering the systems you grew up with when you were a child is typically how that goes, which is why people so fondly remember some of these systems. Like, I sit there and a part of me is like, no, man, Super Nintendo was for like the hardcore real gamers. I say that because I was a child when it came around. Even Sega's own marketing against Nintendo at the time was Nintendo stuff is for children, Sega's for adults. It's very different. Anyway, that's just a long way of saying that I think that my opinion on this whole thing hasn't really changed much. And that isn't necessarily a negative. It's just an observation. And we see where it's all going now as far as everything just kind of got dull when all the creative companies whose entire business model was let's make a machine and make games for it to make the most interesting product. When that is no longer relevant, then you just have the same games from third-party companies popping up on every platform, and your handful of exclusives from Sony and Microsoft are just kind of not enough to push the needle. Anyway, that was a long-winded thing, but you go ahead, Abdullah.
I mean, I can't add much to what you said because I see it from the same angle.
I just want to be clear to everybody, I'm not saying that consolidation of technology is necessarily a bad thing. That's the whole point of the discussion. What we're simply saying is it occurred. And this is when it occurred.
Yes.
The PlayStation 2 largely triggered that occurrence. It was the foundation of that. You like your Resident Evil games, right?
Yeah.
I would kind of think of the PlayStation 2 in console history like the Resident Evil 4 of the franchise. meaning it was very different from everything that came before it, and it was very much appreciated in its time for that refreshing sense. But when you see where the series eventually goes, things like Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 and how it eventually just completely collapsed in on itself, and you're like, wow, this kind of sucks. I kind of want to go back to Resident Evil 2 remake, Resident Evil 3 remake, as we eventually would get. You can kind of look back and be like, I kind of feel like that came from the PlayStation 2 and Resident Evil 4. You know, it's just, the game was good in of itself, but it's also the original sin that changed the industry and the direction of everything. PS2 is kind of like that. And yeah, I know that's hard for a lot of people to hear because they love that system so much. And I'm not saying you can't. Like I said, in of itself, standalone, very good game console, no dispute. But from a simple marketing perspective, it's objectively what changed everything. It was also the exact same time and era and part of the reason why Sega abandoned consoles altogether. So it's like you lost one of the main pillars of what drove creativity in the industry in favor of a technocracy. And that's unfortunate because now we've gotten to the point where everyone, it doesn't matter what team you're on, if you're on PC, you're on Nintendo, you're on Sony, you're on Microsoft, whatever. The one thing everybody seems to agree on is games feel very creatively bankrupt these days. And I think that's a consequence of lack of motivation, in part, because you don't really have these corporate agendas behind making sure their console works and that they win solely on the principles of good games. It's way too easy for Microsoft or Sony, especially those two, to just lean in on, well, yeah, the games aren't great, but don't worry, we've got a bunch of older stuff that works, and we've got, if you want, you can watch Netflix and YouTube. You can do other stuff on here. You don't have to, like, just worry about the games. When that's your attitude, imagine that attitude, like, during the Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo era. If Nintendo or Sega had come out and been like, yeah, we know that the games aren't really that good, but don't worry, because, like, you know, we've got X band, so occasionally you can play online. You'd have been really disappointed in that. And we just kind of put up with it because we've gotten used to putting up with it. That's all.
Yeah, it's more of a, this is how it is, than we don't like that it happened. It's just that this is how it evolved into.
Charm is one of those things that's actually very difficult to put into any sort of calculation like this.
Exactly.
So
because
rather
it's very
than focus
subjective.
on that, exactly, much like a collector's opinion of what is worthwhile to them is subjective. But I think both of these subjects kind of tie together nicely in that regard. I will wrap it up now. So thank you very much, Lodmot, for that particular subject. Abdullah, obviously, thank you for joining me and for that subject as well. Joseph for joining us earlier. Shout-outs, of course, to Spencer Puryear, Sinjeet, as well as shout-outs to Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, and Trey Wagner. Thank you all so much for your support. As always, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that before, and check out all the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, which, again, this is proudly sponsored by, well, we're not sponsored by Patreon, but it's sponsored by you who are Patreon backers, where you get early access to this, as well as all my videos in general. I appreciate the support, keeping the lights on. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and we'll see you all later.